Well, hello again, everyone. Now we are ready to start, and thank you for waiting for some of the latecomers to come in. So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the PMI Victorian History Library. If I haven't met you, I'm Carmel O'Keefe. I'm a member of the board, and I am part of the library's Programming, Marketing and Communications Committee. I'd also like to acknowledge other board members here tonight. Dennis is over here. Wave, Dennis, and also our staff here, Alan and Lauren, who we've met on the way in. And of course, I want to give a very special welcome to our guest tonight, our library's patron, Professor Clare Wright OAM, and I'll introduce her more fully in a minute. Our library is located on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present, and to the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here or watching us online. In their language, I'd like to say Wurundjeri. Who's here for the first time tonight? Oh, we love to see newcomers and we love to see repeat audiences. So those of you who've heard this before, you might be able to fill in some of the gaps, but for those of you who are new, the PMI Victorian History Library has called Prahran home since 1854. And we're the second oldest public library in Victoria. The first one isn't the State Library, by the way. We have a collection of more than 70,000 items and take pride in being the only library in Australia with such a specialised and extensive collection available for loan. So if you're not a member and you become one, you can take any of the books home with you, but you've got to bring them back. Our focus is rooted in local history, housing a wealth of information encompassing most towns in Victoria. So I do encourage you. You'll see some of the display tonight, which is on the topic we're talking about, but the collection of 70,000 is amazing. So I do encourage you to have a look at the online catalogue. So before we get into it, I've got to do some admin things. The bathroom is through the main doors. Turn right and the bathroom is on your left. In an emergency, our staff will make sure you get out safely, but there are two exits. There's one behind you through the main doors that you came in. You follow the green man running those signs, and there's also an exit out here. You'll see the sign up there. So our library staff, who's Lauren and Ellen tonight, will be taking photos and videos during today's event for promotional purposes and to put up on YouTube so you can see this again. If you prefer not to be included, please let them know and they'll make sure that happens. And tonight's presentation is part of History Month and Seniors Month. It's also our annual Exploring Victorian Voices event. And with so much going on, so pleased to see so many of you coming along here tonight. So, with that, I'd like to welcome our library patron, Professor Clare Wright OAM, for a conversation that will explore the stories behind Victoria's monuments and what inspired her to initiate a monument of one's own. Clare is the co-founder and co-convener of A Monument of One's Own. It's a not-for-profit advocacy group that's campaigning for statue equality and commemorative justice for women. Clare wears many hats. She's an award-winning historian, author, broadcaster, public commentator who has worked in politics, academia and the media. And we're really honoured to have you with us here tonight. So everyone, please, a round of applause for Clare as we get started. So this is conversational. We will have some illustrations to look at along the way. But Clare, probably an obvious first question. Tell us about the origins of this project, A Monument of One's Own. What inspired you?
Yeah, thanks so much, and it is wonderful. Thanks so much. It is wonderful to be here again. It was a year, around this time last year, that I came to talk about my latest book, Nakudaruk. So it's a nice to know for me to chart time by that as well. It's a year on since that book has come out, and thanks again for welcoming me as your patron of this organisation. I think it's so wonderful what you do here, and thank you all for coming out on a Tuesday night as well. I also would like to pay my respects to traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered. Wurundjeri people acknowledge that this is stolen land and that sovereignty was never ceded. So as you said, I wear many hats, and why get involved, why start up an organisation, why begin a campaign that is absolutely has no profit to it whatsoever, and it's not like a book, you don't sell anything, and this has been an absolute passion project of mine for many years now. And it came about through a radio documentary that I was actually making for Radio National. So back in 2016-17, I made a series for Radio National. I presented, I was the host and the writer of a series called Shooting the Past. And that series took an historical photograph. We've got so many great ones here at PMI. But I took it, the series was based on taking an historical photograph and then trying to work out what was going on in the picture and interviewing 3 people, an historian, somebody who was connected to the picture in some way, and then some other expert in the field. And one of the photos that I used as part of the first series of Shooting the Past was a very famous photo of Zelda de Prahran, the equal rights campaigner, and this wonderful photo that was very much used as an icon of the second wave women's movement and has become ingrained in the trade union movement. And for people who don't know the story of Zelda in the photograph, that's what we told in that particular episode. And I was fortunate to be able to interview Zelda herself for that episode, and also interviewed Anne Summers and Jed Carney for that episode as well. And so if you're not familiar with the photograph, we'll see it a little bit later, I'll show you, but it's a picture of Zelda de Prahran chained to the front of the Commonwealth Arbitration Buildings in 1969, the year of my birth, after an arbitration in court had gone down against the ruling against the meat workers who were looking to get equal pay for women, one pay rate, single pay rate for men and women. And that had gone down, and she had decided that no women were actually allowed to speak in court that day. There had been no women who had given their evidence, had given any testimony, and she decided to protest against all of this by chaining herself to the front of the building. So as part of the documentary, the radio documentary that I was making, I went and stood on the spot where Zelda had made that protest. The building was no longer there. It's in the city. I'm up near Spring Street and sort of Victoria Street there. And Jed Carney was with me, and I said in that, wouldn't it be great if there was a statue here where we could tell Zelda's story through seeing a statue, and people could walk by and they'd wonder about it. And then a couple of years later, 2019, I posted on Instagram saying it's 50 years since Zelda de Prahran made her famous stand on this spot and in this photograph. Who would like to see a statue of Zelda de Prahran? Just kind of one of those things you say on social media. Well, there was an enormous outpouring of support for that idea. And one of the people who came forward and direct messaged me was a woman called Christina Zavica, a feminist journalist, an American, but she'd worked for many years in Britain. She worked for the Equal Opportunities Commission, and she worked in human rights. And she got in touch and she said, well, why don't we make this happen? And so it was the two of us putting our hats together and our heads together and deciding that we would make this statue happen. We would get this statue of Zelda de Prahran up. And it was in the process of beginning that campaign, really, to get funding for a statue of Zelda, that we realised the extent of the problem. That it wasn't just that there wasn't a statue of this particular one woman who had done an amazing thing. It was that, in fact, less than 3% of statues in Australia are of full-bodied, real women, real historic women who had done something that you could put a name to. And why I make that distinction, kind of clumsy distinction, is there's plenty of statues of female imagery, yeah? So you know, I iconographic, idealized women's bodies usually, and so nymphs, goddesses, depictions of virtue or equity or justice are generally in a female form, largely and very often with their breasts exposed. But these are not women who you could point to and say, oh, that's the woman and she did something. Less than 3% of statues in Australia. There are more statues of animals in Australia than there are of women. There are more statues of birds in Sydney than there are of women. And once we started realising this, we thought, well, actually, this is a much bigger campaign. We found one piece of research that had been done by a PhD student that showed of the 580, and these are the ones that have just been announced, so there's a third round of it now. So so from that, 18 new statues in Victoria have been or will be built in the last 3 years under pressure from the Monument of One's Own. So we very much wanted to follow the actual photograph of Zelda de Prano holding her protest. And there are several reasons for that. The City of Melbourne wasn't keen on that idea because they were more wanted to have something that was non-figurative. They liked non-representational art. It was in favour with their public art program. And so to have a photo that was being very clearly followed was too figurative for the program that they were running in public art. So I'm not going to comment about the merits of that or otherwise, but we weren't going to be able to fit with the agenda of the City of Melbourne in that case. One of the reasons we really wanted to follow the statue very closely was because I knew from speaking to Zelda in that first interview I had with her that she had orchestrated every single thing about the photograph that was taken that day. She had alerted the media to the fact that she was going to chain herself to this building. She had organised the chain that some of her mates from the MUA, the Wharfies, had given her chain, and she had sewn her clothes. She had taken a lunch break. She had made sure that she hadn't drunk anything that morning, so she didn't need to wee while she was chained, because she didn't know how long she would be there before somebody would come and cut her off or move her on or arrest her or whatever it was going to be. And she had leafleted in the city to tell people that she was going to be there to get a bit of a crowd around. And then surely the media came and they took a photo of her. That was the one earlier on in one of the slides that you saw there, and of her. And it is so rare for a woman to get to curate their own media image, to be able to actually control the representation, at least the initial representation, that we didn't want to muck with that in any way. We didn't want that to have to be filtered through a public art committee to decide which bits we're going to, how to allegorize various parts of it. This was how Zelda wanted to be remembered on that day and subsequently. And I had discussed with her and her family, her daughter and her granddaughter, having a statue of her. And they were very supportive of the idea. So that's how that came about. It was very important to have a figurative statue. And so when we then got the funding, so a Monument of One's Own teamed up with Trades Hall Council and to put in funding for the Victorian Women's Art Project, and we received it. And so then we went out to tender for an artist. And the artist we selected was Jennifer Mann, who is a Victorian-based sculptor. She's actually best known for her forensic sculpture. She does a lot of sort of death masks, and that she does for the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine. And so we knew that she would be able to produce something, really true to life, true to Zelda. and we were really wrapped with her presentation in so many ways. So this is a picture of us out in her studio, and in the middle of winter, obviously, where it's really cold. And this is the full life size. So Jennifer had made us a little maquette as part of her presentation, and this was Zelda rendered in clay. So that whole model is of her in clay. We're obviously very pleased. And then the next step was she was taken to a foundry. And so then she's turned, the clay model is turned into molds, and then she's poured, and then that's what she looked like in the end, still in the foundry there. So the statue is actually called Unchained. So the only difference between the original photo is in the photo she has the chain wrapped around her waist and wrapped onto the door. So we've taken it the one step is that she's unchained. The chains have come off, but they're also very symbolic, the chain, of all the links in that chain. Because one of the things that Zelda said, told me, and is also written in her terrific autobiography, which I assume is here in the library somewhere, is that on the day when she chained herself, a policeman did come to take her, to unchain her, to cut the chain off. He said, where's the key? And she said, I don't know where the key is. She knew perfectly well it was on a ring around her neck. But he cut her off, and he said to her, what do you think one woman's going to do? And she said, well, you'll see. Today there is one of me, and tomorrow there will be two, and the next day there will be more, and it will keep going and it will keep going. It'll be a chain. Oh, no, sorry. It's the statue's called Chain Reaction. It'll be a chain reaction. And so that's what the statue is called, and that's what it represents. And down there, I've got a picture later on. Underneath the chain, there's a there's a plaque on the ground there that has that quote from her. We'll see it in a minute. So then this is actually installing it out the front of Trades Hall Council, and that was also made our life much easier. The position of it, when it had to be, when we thought it was going to go with the City of Melbourne, there was it had to be on City of Melbourne land to do that. And then there's a whole palaver about where that could possibly be. And once we figured out that it wasn't going to be a City of Melbourne project anymore, then we could use Trades Hall land, and they have all the ownership over the land. And I've subsequently learnt so much about how to go about these things. And now one of the things that I do with a monument of one's own is give advice to other local groups around the country who are trying to get statues built. For example, there was a group of the Rotary in Mudgee wanted to get a statue of Louisa Lawson built, because in Mudgee there's Henry Lawson Drive and Henry Lawson pub and Henry Lawson roundabout and Henry Lawson everything. But obviously Louisa, his mother, who was more than just his mother, was a famous suffrage campaigner, journalist, writer, poet, and publisher, and they wanted to put a statue of her. So they rang me and said, how do we go about this? And one of the things that I did was write a letter to the council stating her importance as an historical figure, but then also making an argument for the importance of statues of women as part of a commemorative act of commemorative justice. And one of the first things that I always tell these groups is you need to know where your location is going to be, and you need to have approval from the relevant landowner before you even go the next step of trying to get approval for it. So the fact that we were essentially on private land at Trades Hall made a big difference. And so here's the unveiling day. Julia Gillard and the Minister for Women's, Natalie Hutchins, unveiled her. And then media begets media. So then there it goes. And I'll stop that part of the story and go on to the next bit when you get there.
Just picking up on that location, you would have seen in the photographs there's a little low wall that sort of circles behind Zelda, and it really is remarkable, the chain reaction, because I go past there just about every day and see people sitting there and kind of like we're behind you, Zelda, you know, we're sitting here. It is a gathering place. I've seen people gather.
And that was the whole idea of that part of the design. So there's the statue design, which is one thing, and then there's the landscaping design. And one of the things about getting a statue built is that whoever the landowners are that where the statue is going to go, they also effectively have to sign off on the maintenance of the statue and the management of the land around it. And that's going to include things like security, lighting, any landscaping that has to happen. So one of the things in the landscaping here that we very much wanted to do was to make a meeting place, to reinforce that message of it's not a single person, it's not a single act. And the importance of that in relation to Zelda as well is because she would be the first to say that the women's movement and feminism in general, but particularly the second wave women's movement that she was part of, is collective action. Unionism is collective action. Generally, it's only in American superhero movies that one person saves the day. And you know, all women who have been involved in activist organisations know that it is a collective activity. And so that is kind of at odds. That actual way that social reform happens, the way that activism works, is at odds with the very nature of public statuary, which is part of a much more 19th century British colonial imperialist idea. And that's what the 110 statues of Captain Cook obviously look like around the country. It's not Captain Cook and all the blokes who were on the ship with him and doing the work of getting him across the seas. It's Captain Cook, you know, claiming things. How many statues of men can you think of where they're standing, you know, like this or like this or like this or, you know, pointing.
On a big horse.
Yes, I've got a lot of photos of those statues. I take them everywhere. And this is one of those once seen, you can't unsee it kind of situations. So that kind of conqueror's sort of stance and the claiming stance. And so that is really very much part of the design, of the logic, and of the instrumentality of statuary as a tool of colonialism, that we wanted to both use the form of statuary, because everybody knows how to read it, essentially. Everybody knows how to read that if there's somebody on a plinth, they're important. If you put someone on a pedestal, you put them there because society values them in some way. And so part of the whole argument of a monument of one's own was that how do we learn to read our civic landscapes when they are so devoid of public representations of women? So when little girls, little boys walk down our city streets, what messages are subliminally coming to them? The messages that are subliminally coming is that men did something important and no women ever did anything important. And so that kind of adds to what's called the respect gap in society generally. It is not only inequitable, it's inaccurate about history, and then leads to the devaluing and diminishing of women's activities, both in the past and we would argue in the present as well. And so that act of putting somebody on a plinth, on a pedestal, is very symbolic, even if there's a lot of other problematic aspects of statuary. So yes, the seating position is incredibly important. And the last thing I'll say on that is, I don't know, maybe a year after Zelda's statue went up, the ABC News wanted to do a story about public commemoration, and they asked me to be in the news story, and they said, let's do it in front of the Zelda statue. So I met the cameraman down there, and he said, oh, we're going to have to wait for a while because of that. And what that was a whole school group sitting around there. And they were being spoken about. There was a tour guide from Trades Hall, actually, who was talking to them about, as we were sitting there, about equal rights, about about the pay gap, the gender pay gap, about why we still have a gender pay gap, even after Zelda had made her stand, about the role of women in the trade union movement. And this, I was listening to, and this is what they were being told about. And I said to the cameraman, there's your answer. If you're planning to ask me, why is it important to have statues of women, just film that. There's your answer right there. Job done. And it's, you know, that is a really wonderful and very gratifying part of work like this.
Well, you've spoken very eloquently about how public monuments influence the way we understand our own history. Being the data nerd that you are, and have you gathered any data, or have you had any other, I guess, information about the impact that statue has had?
That's an interesting question, because it's partly anecdotal and partly evidence-based. So one of the things, we've recently just managed to finally attract some funding. So there's a philanthropist who has given us a small amount of money to do continued research. And that's just happened, so it's kind of breaking news. And that is the exact thing that we're going to do, is to try to put some more data around the impact of the campaign, but also look to the areas where there are still, I mean, obviously there are still great gaps. But what we do know is clearly in Victoria, there are now 18 more statues. One of the things that we did probably around 2022, so COVID got in there and it was everything was pretty wacky and COVID-y for a while, obviously. So we just started to get our straps together in 2019. We were going to launch in early 2020, then COVID happened. So it took a while to get back up and running again. And one of the first things that we did was to put out a survey, a voluntary survey, to all of the city councils, the capital city councils, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide, and all of the group of 8 universities, Sydney Uni, Melbourne Uni, asking them to create an inventory of their public art and asking them how many statues of full-bodied women they had, how many statues of Indigenous women they had, and Indigenous men they had in their collections or on the lands that they oversaw. It was voluntary, but most of them got back to us with a little bit of humbugging. City of Sydney didn't, and Tasmania didn't. But what that did was allowed us to kind of create a league table. And there's nothing like a bit of naming and shaming. And so once that league table might have gotten into the hands of SBS, they did a big story on it. And I was contacted not long after by the City of Melbourne, who then the Deputy Lord Mayor of the City of Melbourne at the time, Nicholas Rees, who's now the Lord Mayor, was very activated by the Zelda campaign and was really disappointed and cross that the City of Melbourne hadn't been able to build it themselves for a whole bunch of bureaucratic reasons, essentially. And he was adamant, particularly after the survey came out, that the City of Melbourne was going to address this problem head on. And he instituted a motion into council, and I went and spoke at council. It was from the public gallery. It was quite exciting. And about the need for there to be more statues in the City of Melbourne, and where we knew there was this statistic of 9 out of 580, so that not very good number. And now we had Zelda and a couple more that were in the process of being built. And that motion went through, and the City of Melbourne promised to build 3 new statues of women. And then they started a process for that. They had a public call out for names of women that might be memorialised in this way, or commemorated in this way. And they had more, in the time that survey was open, they had more submissions than they had to any other public call out for anything previously. I think it was well over 1,500 people And then they had a statues advisory committee that I chaired, and we came up with using the statistics that were given to us from the public and our own kind of input, but mostly it was coming from those public submissions. We nominated 3 people who we thought should be the first 3 cabs off the rank. And so that then leads us to Melbourne. So part of your, and earlier on it was out of sequence. Once Melbourne City Council did this, Sydney went, oh, we've got more statues of birds than women. In fact, we don't actually have any full-bodied statues of women, and that's probably the reason why we didn't answer the survey. So when I'm saying this full-bodied women, named historical women, obviously I'm making a distinction between allegorical women. I'm also just making a distinction between statues of Queen Victoria. There are a couple of those, and busts. You know, there are a few busts around. Not these busts. These busts. There's plenty of these busts, as I said earlier, on statues of women as well. But so there are a few busts about. But we were actually looking to, so you can compare oranges and oranges. We were looking at full-bodied statues of named women. So Melbourne goes first. Sydney, then City of Sydney, then passes a resolution. Another thing, Kim Rubenstein, who is on our board, Kim and I went and sat in front of the then head of the National Capital Authority in Canberra, and we asked her a question that we already knew the answer to, which is generally a good way to ask questions if you're trying to get something. We said, how many statues are there of full-bodied historical women in the land that the National Capital Authority has jurisdiction over, which is essentially the parliamentary triangle in Canberra. So all that bit above the bridge there. And she had to answer what we knew already, which was 0. And we said, it's 2023. Do you reckon that is an adequate representation of the way that Australia wants to have its political culture known and remembered in the national capital, for all the tourists who come, for all the people who come from around the country, for all the kids who go on their pilgrimages in grade 6 to the national capital, that this is what you want to have happen? There'd been recent statues. It's not like these were old statues. There was a statue that had been erected. Isn't that an interesting verb? That's what we say about statues. You want to erect a statue. There was a statue built of Andrew Inglis Clark on Constitution Avenue. That was the one that was the most recent one that had been built in Canberra. It's absolutely enormous. It's like towers. I should know actually how many feet it is, but maybe like 30, like it's really big. And I said to her, how did they choose that Andrew Inglis Clark? I mean, how many of you know who Andrew Inglis Clark is? Okay, one person and can I also say a certain generation knows who Andrew Inglis Clark is. If Andrew Inglis Clark is often known as one of the founding fathers. He was involved in the drafting of the Constitution, and he's often known as being for what they call the Hare-Clark system of proportional representation. Okay, but the actual person who invented that system was Catherine Helen Spence. And Catherine Helen Spence and Andrew Inglis Clark were contemporaries. And Catherine Helen Spence, in her time, was the person who was recognised as being the mother of proportional representation. Even people like John Stuart Mill, the father of political philosophy in England, acknowledged Catherine Helen Spence for her contribution to political economy. But that had, by the time they were building a statue and trying to work out who to put there, they decided to put Andrew Inglis Clark. And I said, who made that decision? She said, we had a statues advisory, committee. I said, how many women were on that committee? Well, as many women as there were statues of in Canberra is the answer to that. So that was, a conversation that we had. And then the next year, the statue of should have put a picture of it up, of Enid Lyons and Dorothy Tangi at the front of Old Parliament House emerged. The statue is fondly known as the Dames, and I'm reliably informed by people who live in Canberra that every day there's a new bunch of flowers that's put in their hand, or scarf wrapped around their neck, sometimes footy scarves if it's seasonal, or something put in their hats, that they're very much a well-loved part of Canberra culture now. And then the year after that, the statue of Susan Ryan was unveiled on the other side of Old Parliament House. And A Monument of One's Own are now campaigning for a statue of Catherine Helen Spence to be built kitty corner, same artist, same size, so she can be in conversation with the person who was actually her historical contemporary. And we're chipping away at that. We do have authority from the National Capital Authority, and we're looking at that there's private landholders, and we're pretty much up to the fundraising part of that now. And then there's another campaign for a statue of Pauline Menser, the surfer at Bondi Beach. I've been involved in that, and that's just reached its funding threshold to go ahead. And the one of Louisa Lawson that I said before, there's a new one that's gone up in Perth. So this is why we need to actually start to get some hard numbers around this. At the moment it's anecdotal. What is very clear is that whole thing of what's seen cannot be unseen, that once you do say to city councils and authorities and governments that this is what the problem is and do you think it's good enough, then they have to answer that question in some kind of way.
That visibility is so important, isn't it? And I could see the support and hear it from the audience as you were talking about getting that other statue.
So this is just to let you know that the Vida Goldstein statue is the first one that's been announced by the City of Melbourne. So she was on our advisory committee. She was the one that we nominated as the first cab off the rank. Obviously, there's a couple of books about Vida on the stand that you've got out the front there. Australia's preeminent suffrage campaigner, our international ambassador, a diplomat for Australia's world leading gold standard in democracy, which my book, Your Daughters of Freedom, is about, and I've written about, and Vida, and included her in 2 ABC documentaries that I've made. And the only thing that recognises her contribution to Australian history at the moment is a park bench in her home city of Portland. She was the first woman to stand for Parliament in Australia and also in the Empire, and she stood for Parliament 5 times. She didn't win a seat because she only stood as an independent. She refused to join a political party. And so when the park bench was revealed, some local journalist quipped that Vida had finally gotten her seat. But this is to show you that the City of Melbourne is dedicated to building it, but they're not funding it. They are fundraising for it. And they have this Lord Mayor's charitable institution, so if you wanted to see it being built, you could. And part of our whole thing at the Monument of One's Own is to be working against this cake stall model of women's fundraising for women's things, to say that this is a piece of public infrastructure, cultural infrastructure, like a bridge or, exactly, and that funding is always a matter of priority, and they could prioritise this as part of an operating budget, but instead it's part of a fundraising budget at the moment. But you have the opportunity to contribute, and there are some organisations. Ellen is wearing her amazing Vida t-shirt. Look, she's going to show you at the moment that we didn't even plan this. And this organisation, High Teas, who made Ellen's beautiful shirt, are contributing $5 from their Vida merch to the Vida statue, and there have been some philanthropic contributions as well. And I'll get onto that after.
You just pop back to the last
Yes,
one.
you can. Yes, I can.
So Claire, it seems like you've become the go-to commentator on everything statues when it comes to the media. I've seen you quoted in various other articles, and perhaps changing tack a little bit. It's interesting to sort of reflect on why there might be perceived decision-making or fear about having statues. And we all know that statues have been a target for protest and vandalism around the world, also in Victoria. How do you reconcile that as a historian? How do you reconcile that sort of anti-history sentiment against what you're trying to achieve?
It's a really good question, and yes, every time a Captain Cook statue is vandalised, I do get contacted by the media. And so what I always say is I don't condone the vandalism, but I understand why people do it. And why they do it is because statues represent power. And in my speech at the opening, at the unveiling of Zelda, I said, one of the things that I said is that if in 100 years' time there's a group of ratbags who come along and tear Zelda down, we know that's because she now represents power. And that is something that I actually hope might happen one day, that she is seen to be such a threatening figure that people want to eradicate her. I mean, the alternative to that is a kind of horrible Handmaid's Tale situation, where the idea is that from a repressive point of view, you don't want to see any signs of women's achievement because you are discouraging women from achieving anything. So, but that's what we see around the world when statues come down. So when they pulled down the statue of Rhodes, that was part of the anti-slavery movement. When they pulled down the statue of Saddam Hussein, and look, I'm just thinking of images that we can, know from the news and as part of 20th and 21st century politics, global politics. When those statues come down, it's because they're no longer seen as relevant, or they're seen as being symbolic of a fallen regime. So that's literally when Rhodes came down. This campaign was Rhodes Must Fall as part of that anti-slavery campaign, and so of course our interpretation of history changes. So when Captain Cook statues have paint thrown on them, or he gets sawn off at the ankles and bits of him carried off, it's people making a statement about the damage that has been wrought through the very actions that are being celebrated in that statuary. What I've always said is that instead of tearing statues down, I would prefer to see more put up. So that instead of losing that history or defacing that history, that we make that history that is seen through public commemoration more inclusive, so that we broaden our notion of who might be remembered, who might be commemorated, and what they might be commemorated for. And I think that that's only a matter of funding. There's plenty of places where we could dot them, we could put them all over the joint. And, they regularly do happen. There's a statue of Shane Warne and one on Molly Meldrum that just seem to go up overnight like mushrooms over in Richmond. And around the MCG, there are sports people popping up, fortunately now sports women, but interestingly, the largest component of statues of women that there are, of those 9 that I was saying before we started campaigning, the majority of them are of female sports people. So essentially, women who do bloke things and do them well.
Except for Nova Paris, who we're still trying to
we're trying to get her out of
get
cold
out
store.
of storage.
So that would be what that's my general line there, is that we put up more statues, we remember more people, we make the table larger, the table of history larger, we pull up more chairs to it rather than cut the table down.
Do you think those statues that are targets need to have new context given? This sparked a conversation with Ellen and I before we started about libraries have collections of contentious material written in the colonial era,
Yes.
saying things that we know are not true, we have to deal with that in terms of giving the context of that was a point of time, point of history. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really important point. And you know, the campaigners for taking statues down, what they would say, and I don't disagree with this, is that, you know, particularly for a lot of, say, African American people who have to, in their towns and cities, have to walk past statues of slave owners or of campaigners in the Civil War. I mean, obviously, there's an enormous amount of Civil War statuary and commemorative art, that they have to walk past people every day on the street who they know enslaved their ancestors, who they know perpetrated brutal violence, who raped their grandmothers, and there they are, you know, on a pedestal. Why should they be made to suffer the indignity of having to walk in the shadow of these people? And you know, I think it's a very persuasive argument for removing certain statues. And I would say, if I have you know, if you are part of a group that is campaigning to get something up, and you do, well, good on you. If you are part of a group that's campaigning to get something put down, well, good on you, because that shows the processes of history as well. That's how social reform works. And people raise their voices, and then their voices get heard if the time is right, or they have the microphone enough. So I'm not averse to that argument of campaigning to get statues taken down in that kind of way. But the alternative to that is having interpretive material that's placed next to a statue like that contextualises in a more contemporary historical theoretical framework who that person is, what he did. There can be other ways in which his legacy or his memory is kept, or the narrative that is told about that person, rather than just walking past and thinking he's a bloke, he's on this pedestal, he must be important. You know, that takes work, obviously. You've got to have people that have got the time to stand in front of it and read it. And there's a lot of cool ways that we can use technology now to, you know, QR codes that you can click on, and that'll take you to a website, so you don't have to stand there and look at it in the moment when you're rushing past to catch a bus. You can QR code onto it. You can go home and then later look at the website that gives you all the extra information and has more links. I think that is a terrific use of technology, and I actually want to show you something in regard to that, if I've answered that question directly. Okay. Yeah. So I want to recognise that one of the other things that's been really exciting that's happened since A Monument of One's Own started was that the whole idea of what I've called commemorative justice has taken off in a variety of directions. So it's not only statues of women that we're looking at now when we're thinking about how do we remember people in the past. So one of the organisations that really got on board the idea of commemorative justice is Gender Victoria, Victorian Government Agency. And they've been raising the whole notion of place naming, so nomenclature. What do we call things? So it's one thing to see a representation, but we also see or experience the impact of the gender gap in naming practices all the time. How many streets, how many buildings, how many freeways, how many universities, how many law courts are named after men or women respectively. And so that has been a what gets measured gets managed situation. And so I've been working with Gen Vic and another organisation that is part of Gen Vic called Put Her Name On It, which is a fantastic organisation. I encourage you to look up what they do, because they've been a very interactive. So Gen Vic is now so that they're using some of our data and as part of their campaigns. And they have been campaigning for new Victorian government policy, which has come into fruition now. And the Victorian government has committed that 70% of all new commemorative places will be named after women. And so that's new things. It's not necessarily renaming. Renaming is a whole nother area, but new places that will be named after women. And you can see some of the stats that are here. So Her Place Museum, and this is what I want to come to. So Her Place Museum, put her name on it, and we've had a kind of working group, and I've been representing a Monument of One's Own on it, put together this aid called Finding Her. So you can go onto the website, and this allows you to click on and show you where there are commemorative plaques or statues or other ways of remembering women. So technically, you could go on a driving tour around Victoria if you wanted to. You could go on a Finding Her driving tour, physical tour. You could also do it as a virtual tour sitting at your desktop. And so once you click on one of the icons, you'll get to the person, and then once you click on the person, you'll get to, this is only half the page, you'll get to more information about them. So you get the opportunity to learn about Jean Galbraith, who probably not many of you knew about before you walked into the room. Same fellow who knows about, you're very knowledgeable. And just to show you that it's not only 19th century women or, oh God, I was going to say dead women, but poor old Stella is dead. But Stella was one of the first statues in that first batch of the Victorian women's public art, the same one that funded Zelda, funded a statue also of Stella. And I should say that the way that these statues get funded is that groups put in applications for them. And you've got to have sign off from the relevant authority. It's got to be multi-partner. There's a lot of work that goes into an application before it actually becomes successful. So the application that went into Stella, so a group of people in Stall put this one up, and there's a statue of Stella in Stall. I'm sorry, I haven't got the image of that there. And then you can search the directory. There's various other ways in which you can access it. And you can also engage with it yourself. So you can submit your nomination through the Remember a Local to name a place. So one of the things they're doing is creating a kind of database of names as well. And I think this is really important. One of the questions that's always asked of me from when the media come to me about the statue stuff is they say, who would you want to see a statue of? And I say, well, that's not really for me to say. I mean, Vida, obviously, because I've been banging on about that forever. But it actually, these things should come through local organisations. They should come through places like mechanics institutions and local libraries and local councils and local Rotary groups that have an understanding of who has been important in their area and why. And also that's where a lot more women are remembered, particularly in rural and regional areas, because women have been so significant in the founding and the maintenance and the ongoing work of those towns. So they are, this is the Victorian government site here. You can participate in creating this database so that when they do put a new something up, they are looking for a new street name. They're going to go to that in the first instance. So yeah, you can see the partners in that. And then that kind of advocacy is now being taken up by certain councils. So Bass Coast Shire has undertaken a gender impact assessment of its public names. And I love this language of that. It's like an environmental impact statement. So we start to think about the way that we are shaping the built environment and thinking about the ways in which that impacts on our understanding of of historical significance, of a gendered understanding of who our history is about and who our history makers are. Oh, that's the end of my slide.
Well, it's perfect because I've got one final question. We've been going almost an hour. And not surprisingly, it is about looking to the future and thinking about 50, 75, 100 years away from here. And as these conversations about who we memorialise and how we memorialise evolve, what are your hopes, Claire, for the future of public monuments and these other sorts of activities? What do you think the future's going to look like?
I think this snowball is only going to keep rolling along. And one of the things that really excites me is seeing that a younger generation of women taking it up. I would like to acknowledge the work that's being done by a woman called Sita Sargent. And Sita is now living in Melbourne. She's been in Canberra, but she started an organisation called She Shapes History a few years ago. She actually consulted Kim Rubenstein and I very early on. We met in a bar in Canberra and she said, I've got this idea and what do you think? And it was a brilliant idea. And originally her idea was she wanted to lead tours of Canberra to show people all the spots where there should be a monument but wasn't. And so it was kind of like invisible places. So tours of Civic Canberra showing where women had done stuff and the ways that women had been involved in shaping the city, the culture, the politics of Canberra, including First Nations women and including other women who are and groups who are not generally memorialised in those kinds of civic walking tours when you go to a capital city. So also queer history, Sita is very interested in representing. And she started this business, She Shapes History, and it has gone absolutely gangbusters. So it now is not only providing tours in Canberra, but also Sydney and Melbourne. Originally it was all volunteer, Sita, and led most of them, and then just got together a couple of friends who were prepared to do it. Now she's got an army of not volunteers, of paid people. She's getting incredible grants, large grants to scale up the organisation. She's just published a book, which is probably in your collection, called She Shapes History, which is walking tours that you can do all over Australia, where she draws little maps and says you can go around here and you can hold it in your hand or you can use it on your phone. So this kind of taking that very old-fashioned notion of a guidebook or a walking tour, which seems, quite quaint almost, like remember the Lonely Planet, and that's how we used to get around before apps. And so it's taking that notion but upscaling it with technology, and then she's doing specialist ones. Like I just saw that on the 11th of November, this coming one, which is obviously the 50th anniversary of the dismissal of the Whitlam government, she's leading a She Shapes History tour of Canberra that is about what women were doing on that day, how women contributed to the dismissal as we've come to know it. And so providing these counter narratives. And so that energy that Sita has brought to this space is really infectious. And because she's very young, she's very social media savvy, her audience is largely other young people who are watching her on TikTok and following her in that kind of way. There's been this real upsurge in I think, enthusiasm and visibility for the whole idea of commemorative justice and filling in all of those gaps. So I think the future is really bright. If I was blue sky dreaming, what would I like to see? I would like to see all levels of government, local government, state government and federal government, committing actual hard dollars to putting up some of these statues, to following through with initiatives like the City of Melbourne's, like the City of Sydney's, that don't require this kind of cake stall, Kickstarter, crowd fundraising, but actually see these things as part of essential cultural infrastructure for our towns and cities.
Thank you. Well, we do have a few more minutes. If anyone has any questions, I will jump up and because I have the microphone. Does anyone have any questions for Claire? Fascinating to Oh, yes, yes, yes. Yeah, hang on. Let me get the microphone so we can
Just not so much a question, but a plea in a way. I think one of the most important things is this for not to forget history. And the telling of the story and who tells the story is really important. So whenever, get rid of half of Captain Cook, for example, that sort of stuff in terms of justice. But when you actually pull down a whole part of history, then it can repeat itself. And so alongside what you're doing, I think that that's essential. And whoever wants to take those things up, I'll put my hand behind it, but I won't lead it. Is that something that, again, alongside these other organisations coming up, that we should be actually now also pushing for?
What you're saying reminds me of an answer that I gave one journalist at one stage is that I said, well, one of the things we could do is pull statues down, but put them into something called a museum for forgotten heroes.
Yeah.
For example, where we actually
put a red mark on every statue that is contentious, so that immediately it asks you to look behind what's seen. Something really simple.
Yeah, and I like the kind of idea of using an institution like a museum to remember, which we know. I'm the chair of the National Museum of Australia, and we know that museums are places where you go to read history through objects. And that if we had a museum of lost heroes, for example, or forgotten heroes, then we're interrogating the whole idea of what they used to mean, but also making the point that and we could tell their stories, but that they're not who we necessarily want to give visibility to in terms of a streetscape.
I saw another hand up, I thought. Yes.
Mine's a very simple question. You mentioned Western Australia.
Yeah.
And I'd like to look that up and see. I'm from Western Australia.
That new statue that went up?
Yes, you didn't know her name.
Yes, there's a statue of Fanny Bulbeck, the Noongar woman.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Whereabouts is that?
It's in Perth. So Fanny's story is great. She was,
let's say.
yes, good point. I'm pretty sure I can't remember. But if you look up statue of Fanny Bulbeck, you'll find her.
Thank you very much, Claire. And sorry to sort of grab the microphone from the floor or whatever. But that was a tremendous speech of talk. Thank you so much. Because I remember in Perth, in Kings Park, the biggest park in the joint that overlooks the Swan River. Being with my mother, walking through in this hollow, and they had a veil, they had the pond, the beautiful landscaped pond, and this veiled statue, and my mother really, really wanted to know who it was, because it was all very big excitement, but it was the statue of the pioneer woman, and it's a figurative statue who sort of commemorating, well, I suppose, settler women, but the woman's role. And it is quite beautiful if anybody ever heads over to Western Australia, which...
Well, that leads me back to something we talked about earlier on about the Mary Wollstonecraft statue. And I mentioned that's when I was on the drum talking about it, because the controversy about the Mary Wollstonecraft statue, which is in England, so why are we talking about it here, was it made global headlines. Because the local community had fundraised for it and they'd appointed an artist, and there was years of fundraising that went behind it. And the artist had been quite secretive about the process and said that she needed artistic freedom and artistic license. And when it was eventually unveiled, the statue is very, very high, very, very tall, but it's like a kind of the base of the statue is like when you're a kid and you're making mud castles out of sand at the
Drippy
beach
sand.
with the trickling kind of stuff, the trickling sand. And then at the very top of it is a very small statue of a naked woman. And the only thing that's quite remarkable about this naked woman is that she has a very full and open and exposed pubic hair. And it's very clear that that's what it is. And this statue offended a lot of people on a lot of levels. One was the appearance, and this is why it kind of made global headlines, was because it was considered maybe the first public representation of pubic hair. Secondly, it was that Mary Wollstonecraft was a very considerable political philosopher from the 18th century, who was considered the mother of philosophy and the mother of political philosophy and the mother of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, and an incredibly important, serious intellectual who is now being represented as a nude. And the artist's justification for that was that she had represented her as an every woman. And so that's the idea, of the pioneer woman as well. It's that it's not of an individual, it's sort of supposed to represent everybody. But a lot of people were very offended that this obviously white Caucasian woman her body was depicted as quite young and fit. So the depiction of a young, white, thin, toned woman who goes to the gym a lot is the image of an every woman. So a lot of African American women who are very different, or English, British women, black British women who have very different body shapes than that said, well, it's not representing me. I'm not part of that every woman. And so what's happened with that statue is that there's been a kind of, like the dames in Canberra, people wrap a scarf around them or give her, but in a very reverential kind of way. Mary Wollstonecraft is being revered in another way. People keep wrapping her up, like covering her up, covering up her naked form. And then other people remove it and then people put it back. So there's this kind of guerrilla statue acts. But yeah, it's that, again, it's the depicting somebody against actually who they were historically and in of their time in order to make a broader statement about womanhood. If that's what you're going to do, if that's what you've been commissioned to do, but that's not what that statue was, and that's not typically what we've been looking at doing either.
Well, I think we have come to an end. I don't think any of us will look at a statue in the same way ever again after hearing Clare tonight. Clare, thank you so much for having this conversation on behalf of the PMI Library. Thank you for Now, if you want to find out more about Clare and her many hats, including all the books and this project, go to her website, clarewright.com.au. There's plenty of other resources we have on our bookshelf down the back. We'd love to see you again at future events from PMI. Please look at our website and have a look at our events page and you'll see what we've got coming up. But with that, I'd like to thank you. We've still got tea and coffee going at the back there if you want to stay and have a bit of a chat. We'd love to meet you, and thank you very much for attending tonight.